Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the 8th album from BT, Nuovo, Morceau, Subrosa. Alright, I went back and forth a bit on whether or not I wanted to make a proper video for this album at all. I had one guy suggest to me that if I didn't have enough to say on it, I should just include it in the same video as my If the Stars Are Eternal review, especially considering the two albums were released on the same day. Though, obviously, this did not happen. I made this a video. I will admit I don't have a ton to say on the topic of this album, at least in comparison with most BT albums, but I still decided to give it a proper video anyways. So, yeah. So what is Nuovo, Morceau, Subrosa? This is BT's take on straight ambient music. Not his weird hybrid of ambient with IDM and like 7 other subgenres that you saw in this binary universe and If the Stars Are Eternal. No, it's just pure ambient music. A single 46-minute track comprised of 8 movements of various lengths, though for the most part all blending together in a singular blur. This is kind of why I wasn't sure if I wanted to make a video on this, because straight ambient music like this doesn't often provide a lot in the way of discussion material. If not for the separation of this track into the 8 movements, I probably wouldn't have made this video in the first place. Now, did I enjoy this album? Absolutely. I've always been more drawn to BT's more abstract material over his more commercial and dance-heavy stuff. Granted, Morceau Subrosa doesn't strike me as quite as unique an idea as those that went into his other more abstract albums. I mean, there's lots of artists out there who've provided this kind of straight ambient music, perhaps in a more Eno-like fashion. Though even if the premise is not as out-of-the-box as BT probably thought it was at the time, the particular execution on display here could not have possibly come from anyone else. It's still very clearly a BT album, and one that follows his style and hallmarks. You could hear the kind of direction he'd take the album in various ambient passages on his previous albums. Even on These Hopeful Machines, there were moments that hinted towards the kind of stuff he did here. As with all of BT's more abstract work, it's not the kind of thing I see being for everyone, but for all people into ambient music, I would say it's certainly worth a shot. So, let's discuss the actual content then, go down each of the 8 parts, which I did separate this track into on my iPod. I think separating this track up into the 8 parts does help make it into a much more dynamic listening experience, but whatever. So, the first movement, Nicht, Musik, Verklärung, number 2 in D major, German for not music, transfiguration. Okay, shut up, BT. It is music. And it's the most obviously musical part of the whole piece. A shifting and sparkling ambient pad with lots of free-form piano playing on top. I mean, the piano does seem to take more influence from classical music than others, but still, like 20th century classical. It is trying to create this kind of heavenly vibe that totally envelops everything, and is far from the only section of the track to have that atmosphere, although it is the only one with the straight piano playing. The next section, Sonitum, Explicandis, Tardius, or Slow Explanation of Sound, or something like that? Slow Development of Sound? Whatever, it's made up entirely of the shifting electric piano sounds you heard in the intro of The Emergency, or maybe Hymn 808. It's very subtle, though still creating some abstract rhythms and glitchy patterns, and everything is covered in so much reverb. Sounds really nice. Then we get Tabular Sarsa Gamma Algorithm number 13, named after some kind of machine learning thing, I guess, which takes a much darker and more dissonant approach to things. It's a much more uniform pad like that from GODT, if you took out all the rhythmic elements. You still hear some little glitchy noises all around, and the pad does evolve and change a bit over time. I mean, it brings in some strange distorted noises eventually that are also really drawn out and covered in reverb. This is also the longest section of the piece at over 10 minutes, though it doesn't really feel like that either. I mean, Morceau Subrosa does tend to be the kind of album that blends into the background pretty easily, and I mainly found this album easiest to pick apart when I was listening to it on VLC on my computer, and it made the little tiny pauses in between each movement so that I knew when they began and ended. Otherwise, it tended to blend together too well to the point of me only being able to identify maybe the first couple of movements, and everything later on just completely blending together. But I am definitely glad I did sit up and pay attention to what was going on, because BT, of course, packs no shortage of detail and texture into every part, just so happening to execute it in a really subtle way that requires you to know when parts begin and end to get the most out of it. Anyways, part 4, Seraphim, named after the Christian archangels, I believe, is mainly notable for its inclusion of choir sounds. I'm not sure if they're real or synthesized. I'm admittedly kind of leaning towards the latter, but of course they sound absolutely beautiful, really filling up the full sonic spectrum and sounding super expansive and huge. And then we get part 5, Les Particules et les Sortilèges, Muse number 3. The Particles and the Spells in English. I guess inspired by particle physics, as can be seen on the album cover there. Starts out with some reversed pianos and escalates into this kind of monolithic hugeness, just a space-filling cosmic wall of ambient sound. A couple of the choir sounds from the previous part carrying into this, and if there are sonic particles and glitches to be heard there, they are so tiny they can't form any sort of rhythm, more like molecules in an ocean wave, or grains of sand. And there are various other sound effects around it I guess somewhat resemble field recordings, but it's kind of hard to tell. After this giant sounding section, things do get toned down a bit for part 6, The Art of Perpetual Aliasing. I guess made up mostly of artifacts of sound distortion, given the title. A lot of layers of reverb-soaked buzzing sounds, eventually shifting and getting a little glitchier as time goes on top of cricket and seagull field recordings. And then part 7, Chant des Étoiles, Thought number 9K421, Song of Stars in English. As per usual, do not take my word for any of the pronunciations in this video. Again, this is a really subtle composition, not one that introduces any noteworthy new ideas that I noticed, mainly made up of slow-moving chords of humming ambient pads shifting in and out of reality, and some seagull sounds, maybe some more reversed pianos near the end. But there are a lot of those humming ambient pads, and they don't really form any distinct repetitive patterns, maybe returning to some chords occasionally, but staying mostly pretty formless. And that's basically how we close out. Part 8, Apotheosis, basically has all the sounds being built up in the previous part just kind of fading away over the course of a minute and a half. Not straight fading out, of course, but, fading away. I guess there are some really subtle reverse chiming sounds introduced in this part too, and a single bell sound, but that's about it. So that's Morceau Subrosa. Obviously, there's no shortage of interesting ideas to be found here. BT's production quality is as on point as it always is, and he clearly put as much love and effort into this as he would for any other regular album. That said, I think I do kind of put in the lower ranked albums of his. As much substance and interesting sounds and passages as there are in this album, and as beautiful as it sounds, as I mentioned before, is very much an album that falls into the background super easily. Digesting all the random details within and being able to distinguish the various movements takes several lessons of giving it your full attention, and that's no cakewalk when it comes to this kind of straight ambient music. Now that's fine, makes this kind of album a grower, but when it comes to the surface level aesthetic, that's not exactly the most mind-bending stuff you've ever heard. For instance, Brian Eno has a number of albums with the same general vibe and atmosphere that this album has, though he tends to go for a much more simplistic approach to his music. Morceau Subrosa is a bit of a challenging listen, I suppose, at least if you want to get the most out of it. And even if it is definitely recognizable as BT's work, it's still his take on a kind of sound that's already been established by loads of other artists, and doesn't feel quite as unique as his more IDM-ish stuff. I think this is the kind of album that probably won't be everyone's cup of tea. Even I, on most listens of this thing, tend to fall asleep before hitting the halfway mark. But I do have to admire for how much work was clearly put into it, the creative spins that BT does take on this sound, and for just being a really solid ambient release all around. If you're not a fan of ambient music, probably best to skip. This is probably not going to change your mind, but if you do like ambient music, absolutely make sure to pick it up. So, yeah, I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, it is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. If you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time. Nuovo, Morceau,